Austin. Thank you for letting me interview you regarding Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. The purpose of this interview is for you to demonstrate your understanding of the theory and how the theory applies to you and students you currently teach or plan to teach.
Very glad to be here, Whitney. Erikson has much to teach us as educators on how we can be best serving our students. Primarily, he offers us a simple but unique level of understanding, not just where our students are cognitively, but how this level actually functions in their day-to-day lives.
I have never heard of Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. Briefly explain to me salient features of Erikson's theory. What is the source of this information?
Well, I should start by acknowledging how heavily I'll be relying on Dr. Robert Slavin, who actually wrote a book called Educational Psychology, talking, of course, about the various facets of what it's like to teach children and how much of our efforts can be aided by knowledge of their own psychology. So what Erikson really does well is he's able to separate each stage in what he calls the socioeconomic development into stages that are based on age ranges and the general categories that we would typically think of grouping human beings into. The first stage typically takes place from birth to 1.5 years. In this time, Erikson believed human beings are building what we would call trust with their environment, with their mother, with the person raising them, contrasted with a lack thereof if things go astray. This is one reason we might say foster systems are so important, especially in teaching. When we can understand where our students have come from the very beginning of their lives, it often affects them much later, which of course would lead to stage 2, which can take place anywhere from 18 months to about 3 years. And this stage primarily focuses on autonomy versus what we would call doubt with authoritarian structures. So many people call this the terrible twos, in which the child is not only beginning to vocalize their thoughts, but they're beginning to question the thoughts of their primary parental authorities in the household. And they'll start saying no a lot and throwing tantrums as a way to assert their dominance. Stage 3 focuses on initiative versus guilt. And really, this is taking place between ages 3 to 6. Stage 4 highlights industry versus inferiority, taking place from ages 6 to 12. Stage 5 is identity versus role confusion. And this really takes place during adolescence. And perhaps the most important category or stage in all of these stages really happens at that time. Erikson believed that this is when they are starting to test different identities and start to engage in all kinds of behaviors, many of which are self-destructive, in order to better figure out who they are and develop a keen sense of their self. Stage 6 after this begins during early adulthood, he theorized, and it deals with intimacy versus isolation. Many young people are starting to think about getting married or being in a long-term relationship. And the reason for this is, as you become an adult, many of the relationships that would have been in your life prior to this stage are beginning to fade away. People are going off to college, and so the intensity of relationships will increase. And primarily, Erikson focused on how human beings relate to each other relationally, sexually during this time, and that was the main focus for stage 6. Stage 7 takes place during what we would call mid-adulthood, and it deals with integrity versus despair. This is when a person is beginning to deal with who they're going to be, who are they, or how are they going to operate in their lives, raising children, operating at a job, moving in a linear fashion through their company perhaps, and how they're going to do that are all becoming very pertinent topics for them to consider. And then lastly, the previous one was actually generativity versus self-absorption. So let me do a quick flop with those two. Stage 8 would be integrity versus despair, and I'll re-explain that. But stage 7 has to do with generativity versus self-absorption. So is a person going to be a very giving parent, or are they going to try and reinvent themselves and have what Erikson would call the midlife crisis, or what people took to be a midlife crisis from that. And then stage 8, of course, is what I was referring to. As a person is nearing late adulthood, they're looking back on their life and they're trying to figure out if they've remained true to who they are, if they should change, or they may even be despairing over the way in which they've lived their lives. And again, these terms are recorded by Slavin as he got them from Erikson in Erikson's book from 1968. So I'm beyond indebted to Slavin for recording them so well.
Thank you. At what stage of development do you see yourself now, and why do you think so?
Well, personally, I would say that we all find ourselves revisiting these stages throughout our lives. As of now, I classify as being in a stage 6, which is where many of my age struggle with finding a sense of intimacy with someone. Personally, my conviction was to get married to my best friend, who also happened to be the woman I fell in love with. I see myself grappling with a sense of connection with many of my own age. There's a constant sense of fear I have of losing close friends that I've had for a while, but also a profound sense of connection, I believe, that I have with God through Jesus Christ in my own life. My relationship with God is my own example of how I would characterize how Erikson is demonstrating that we're all seeking for a higher intimacy, a higher tight-knit relationship, and so that would be one example I would think of for my own life.
Could you explain how being at this stage of development influences your behavior and outlook in your classroom, and on what would you base this explanation?
Well, I would say one of the counterproductive ways that a person can either become intimate or isolated comes from this fear of being isolated first, trying to seek intimacy, but with intimacy, the implication that Slavin, analyzing Erikson's stage, and really Erikson gets at, is that people are trying to create intense relationships, which oftentimes will isolate them from others who they do not quite trust. And so in that way, it becomes more difficult to build tighter relationships that are also great in quantity. So one example I can think of from being a young teacher is if there are veteran teachers on campus, perhaps who are more intimidating, it might be very difficult for myself to reach out and ask for help if I were struggling in a certain way. And the reason for that would simply be, in order to build intimacy, one of the misconceptions is, well, I can't let them see too much of me. I can't let them get too deep too quick, or I can't let them see my weaknesses or my inconsistencies. And so there might be a lack of reaching out for help that would normally be characteristic of an intimate relationship. So I think that's one negative way, but one positive way could be building intimate and tight relationships with fellow staff members, or building that with advisors and mentors. And I think that this will lead into our next segment, but it's especially important for schools to be reaching out to young teachers so that they can build those tight mentor-student relationships early on.
Identify what level your students are or are likely to be at in Erikson's stages.
Well, I'm a single subject English credential student, and so I would like to think that my students will be at stage 5, that they'll be in a constant state of identifying. But as was my observation actually working in youth ministry for 5 years, I can confirm that while students are identifying and trying to find themselves throughout beginning adolescence at least, and I can certainly remember that not too many years ago, there is also a very good chance that many students who come through our doors have not ever built a foundation of trust. They've never developed a sense of autonomy, and so many of those beginning stages will affect how they seek out identity and the kind of identities they settle on. Many of them may even lapse into taking up a parental identity, something they saw their parent do or how their parent acted in the home. And so as a result, stage 5 is what we like, but it may not be entirely realistic.
Explain how being at this stage of development might influence their behavior and outlook in your classroom. On what do you base this explanation?
Well, assuming that the student is at stage 5, as Erikson predicted that they might be during adolescence. One of the fascinating things about perhaps watching adolescence is that there is a lot of change in dress, a lot of change in talk, groups of friends, the music they listen to, the movies they watch, the people they learn from, the subjects they find fascinating. And so as a result of that, there's a constant flux in their identity, I would imagine. And so if Erikson is to be believed, there's going to be a lot of new people walking into your class, even though they're the same ones you've had all year. So it's good to be considerate of that and to keep in mind that who your student is today may not be who they are tomorrow, whether for good or for bad.
What might be some disconnects between you and your students, keeping in mind the difference in the two stages that you find yourselves at?
Yeah, well, for one thing, I think, especially as a now mid-20s adult, I've arrived at a certain point in my life where I have certain concrete sort of identity statements in place, and I have a kind of self-conception. Even if I'm not totally fond of everything, I have an idea of where I'm at. My students, on the other hand, may not be in that place. In fact, it's quite likely none of them will be. Many of them will still be testing ideas and finding out who they are and who they think they are. And so as a result, it's going to be a bit of a disconnect for me watching these kids in some way sell out to whatever group will give them a sort of identity statement. And if Erikson's to be believed, some of these things can even be self-destructive. So I think the disconnect will happen between a mature adult looking at young, growing adults who are still very much experimenting with who they are and who they want to be.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me. Do you have any final comments you would like to share?
Yeah, I think one final thought would be a reminder that no matter how much we psychoanalyze students, there's still going to be unexpected variables. There are still going to be things that we can't predict, and so it's very good for us to be flexible and to remember that Erikson and Slavin, even after him, are very helpful sources, but they are not the end-all, be-all of educational psychology.
Well, thank you so much.